Welcome everyone. I'm your host Cedric Shannon and we're here at Weathertop Farm. Very briefly, Weathertop is 65 or about acres. We kind of estimate about 3/4 of that is in usable pasture. And we are in the business of raising very delicious, healthy, and ecologically responsible meats. Based on rotational grazing systems, we raise broilers or meat birds and chickens, hens for laying eggs. We have sheep, we have hogs, we have turkeys seasonally, duck, and some rabbit. This is the first installment of a series that I have been thinking about doing for a while now. One of the reasons to do this is simply to give people a basic idea of what it is that we do, what it means to be a sustainable farm, what it actually is involved in regenerative agriculture, particularly when dealing with animals in a rotational grazing system. Beyond the specifics of how we raise things, I would also like to go into the whys of why we do what we do. We're not a hobby farm. We are trying to make a living out of this. But yet we don't think of it as a quaint, fun thing to do. And it's not a lucrative business. But we truly do believe that regenerative agriculture is one of the few real answers to a lot of the issues that we're facing as a globe. It's one way to approach worldwide issues through a local lens. And we will be exploring this as we go on. Personally, I was a philosophy major in college, and I think very much that way still to this day. You'll see that I do maybe perhaps a lot of preamble. I have lots of caveats. Basically, it's a very typical philosophical thing to set out a lot of groundwork, set up your premises and whatnot. And only from there, then you do move on to trying to make conclusions. And hopefully by that time that you've done all that preliminary work, that the conclusions you're arriving mostly make sense. They seem to be relatively logical, or at the very least, a very natural outcome of the thought process. So the first groundwork I'd like to set out is two different paradigms of farming, two different pictures. I do think when you use the word farm as a noun, there's still a place in the imagination of people they can still picture a farm like ours, 65 acres, multiple species, multi-generational family farm where the personal life is very interwoven and sometimes even hard to separate from the business. We've got 3 generations here. We've got community. We've got neighbors. We've got some hired help, and we've got a lot of visitors. But typically, this would be a picture of probably something that maybe their grandparents did, or something in the past. Or if it's of the present, it's typically thought of as something quaint, something fun, maybe something retired to, or if you had an alternative source of income, but not as a real contender, a real player in today's world for producing food. In contrast are the other modern farms of thousands and thousands of acres. If you're talking vegetables, crops, you're talking usually a monocrop with massive machines, heavily dependent on oil, dependent on fertilizer, and very mechanized. Or in the animal world, you got these massive warehouses of tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of animals all packed in, just producing in a factory model. To get to the psyche behind this paradigm, it fascinates me that you could go to you would think a completely unrelated arena and find this verb farm. And I'm thinking of the gaming world where you got these computer games and you got to go up these levels. And there's this term called farming where you have this repetitive, mundane action. You're either acquiring resources or you're getting experience, but you got to do this sort of repetitive work in order to get up to the next level. Now, in some cases, you may be able to pay money and get up these levels. And then it's those that are not willing to pay the money, they have to farm. But then there's some games that even you can't have a go round with money. And then in this case, you'll even have people who will hire others and use their characters, and they'll take the time and do the farming for them. For me, what I'm interested in is what are the assumptions behind that? So typically in a computer game, the resources are infinite. And as you go along, you may set up maybe a city hall or something where you are extracting taxes from your population. And then once you've set up that infrastructure, you know that every day you're going to get 1,000 gold coins or something. And then you may set up a mine, and then you extract ore, and you can depend on getting this much ore every day. You may even set up farms, for food, or you may sheep, whatever, wool. You accumulate these resources, and you set up infrastructure to be able to extract it better. And you also, at the same time, you need experience, so you maybe need to go out and fight bad guys, or maybe other players, or maybe monsters. But these resources and this setup is just always there. And then the other aspect to it, the other assumption, is just that once you set up the infrastructure and the technology, then it just all magically appears. And you may go away and sleep for the night and then check on your computer game the next day, and suddenly your coffers are full, and your storage of the ore and the food and whatnot is good. And then you just need to use it up and, buy something else and keep on growing. And simply these systems that you just amass wealth without really any thought to it. And I think this is just a perfect model of extraction, and it really sets it gives you a sense of the tone of our relationship to these things like food or other resources. I mean, whatever we want. We just go to the store and it magically appears there, and it's nicely packaged, and we purchase it. But we really don't know how it was made, where it came from. I mean, we've made some inroads. We now know about blood diamonds. We have labels like fair trade or organic, or and we try to deal with some of chemicals and non-toxic and whatnot. But really, for the vast majority of what we're purchasing, we have very little connection to it. And when it comes to food, I think as a civilization, we suffer very deeply with that. And so on the personal level, on the societal level, and definitely on the environmental level. So I need to give credit where credit is due. And I think I first encountered the paradigm of extraction really in the writings of Wendell Berry, one of my heroes, and he lived through, at least saw the results of the industrial factory farming taking over, and really the dying out of the family farms. In fact, I find his writing so sad at times that I have a hard time reading it. But he also, one thing that stuck in my mind, that he said that we've often take solutions that nature has figured out over the millennium, and we turn them into several or numerous problems. And to apply that, to really delve into what that might mean, I think what he's referring to is say we take a CAFO of chickens or hogs. You have thousands and thousands of hogs in a confinement operation in a big warehouse. and suddenly you have this incredible density of animals that are on concrete floors or maybe on some sort of plastic something with holes so that the manure and the urine can be washed away, but massive amounts of manure. You bring it in the feed, and the feed goes through the animal, and you got to do something with that excrement. Typically, that goes into a lagoon, and these are massive, massive lagoons of just filled with just an enormous quantity of manure. So whereas nature, this was nature's way of building fertility and closing circles of interrelated animals in the land. Instead, we break those cycles, and suddenly we have waste, a very human concept of waste. And then in the concentrations that it is, it's very toxic. You either have to deal with it chemically or do something with it. At times, even if there's too much rain or there's flood, this can get washed away and become pollution and become toxic to rivers. That's what's being referred to when you have the areas of the blue babies, and these women are giving birth to babies that have had toxins in their systems because of pollutions from lagoons and whatnot. So, but if you think about it, you got to deal with it. So then, even once you've dealt with it and maybe you've now turned it into a product that's usable, now you have to get it to places where they're going to use it, because your farm is not growing stuff. You are raising animals in a building. So we have to transport this stuff somewhere. Maybe you have to transport it to do another process to it so that it can become some sort of fertilizer or whatnot. And then it has to be transported to another distribution center. And then maybe and they're shipped out all over, and then individual farms can buy it and use it. Same for the product. So if you're got 100,000 hogs in a warehouse and you are processing this is not something that you're going to be providing to your local community. You may or may not have a processor nearby, so you're transporting these thousands and thousands of hogs. They get butchered, and then they're transported to a holding place. It could be in another state, some refrigerated or actually freezers, and from there it has to be distributed out, and then it's traveling, being shipped around to all the 50 states. And in each case, they talk about the concept of that your meal has traveled an average of 3,000 miles, and that's what it's getting into. So even if you don't think about the product itself as being extracted, the whole system that buoys it up, that it's dependent on, is all dependent on oil. It's all dependent on transportation. It's all dependent on shipping or trucking and whatnot. And so oil itself is a resource that we extract and we mine, and because of the subsidies, we're able to ship all the stuff around, and somehow it's cheaper that way. Regardless of consequences, such as the waste, the environmental, or even if it's even nutritionally rubbish. So let's contrast that to regenerative agriculture, right? So here we are in a rotational grazing system. Even our hogs, which are not ruminants, they can't depend 100% on grass, but they are out in the fields, and we are feeding them some grain, but we're kind of a wild guesstimation is somewhere between 20 and 25% of their intake can be of the pasture. But we're rotating them. So in our case, typically during maybe not the winter, we don't rotate them quite as much, but all the other 9 months or so, they're getting moved twice a week. And so they get a fresh bit of pasture, which they love. It's amazing how much hogs love to to eat pasture. In fact, you leave them there long enough, they eat so much pasture they go on from what's on top to what's below the soil and dig it all up. But think about the waste. So they're eating, they're excreting, and that gets put back into the land. You move on, you let it go. It doesn't accumulate in quantities that are toxic, and suddenly the output of that system is now the input for an entire different ecosystem of the dung beetles, the worms, the nutrients that the soil needs, and the plants, and you move these animals on, and after a couple weeks, you see this explosion behind them of green, and so there's a loop there. And so, I think what I'm trying to get at in terms of these different paradigms is one of extraction is you're completely disassociated with what you are farming and what you're working with, versus if you see that everything is interrelated. It's not just the person interrelated to the product, but the product, the animal, is also interrelated to the soil. It's interrelated to the land, and in each case the land is what grounds you. I mean that figuratively and literally. And so when there is a connection, then you don't want to hurt the land, and you want, if you're dependent on your pastures to be productive, you're going to treat your pastures right. I think there's a very interesting philosophical question, and you can explore whether technology inherently lends itself to extraction, or if the reverse is true, where an extraction frame of mind leads you to create technologies to achieve those types of goals. I think, though, that behind all that, we always need to remember, regardless of where you fall on that question, that technology is simply a type of power. And basically in all areas, even technology that maybe have come out of a framework that's not so extraction oriented. And when you frame it in the context of power, then I think that we would understand that you need to, in order to use that power wisely, we have to be handled with restraint. And so if you, in an extraction frame of work, to have power is simply to be extract faster and longer and get this whole product out. You're looking for maximum output as quick as you can. This mind frame of maximum extraction doesn't work when you're in a system of interconnected. So, and this can be seen no better than in farming, where there are very, very serious consequences when you don't practice it with restraint. Most businesses, you could sort of abstract this into just a maximum production, which would be your gross sales to net profit, and it could just be a bad decision of crunching your math problem and saying, oh, well, it's a better business decision. But when it comes to food, when it comes to farming, it has repercussions worldwide. So not only are we affecting the environment, or we are polluting waterways, we are eroding and using up our soil by the billion metric tons every year, but we're also detrimentally affecting people's health by not having proper nutrition. Think about the old story of the goose that laid the golden eggs. I can't think of a more relevant story that we need to hear today, but it was basically the goose laid one golden egg a day, which is extraordinarily extravagant. I think trying to say that a goose provides an incredible amount of abundance, and yet in his greed, the farmer wants to get all the eggs at once, so he ends up killing the goose and looking for the eggs inside, and of course there was nothing in there because the goose was making as as it went every day. And I think that's a very beautiful metaphor of what nature does. And in a very real sense, I think of all our animals, kind of like golden geese. Some are even laying eggs, they have golden in yolks inside. But the real golden goose, and this is what I think I'm going to try to apply and try to understand what I'm trying to get at with the whole restraint. For me, the real golden goose is the soil. We cannot continue to look at the soil as something to mine, to extract things from, because in reality, the soil is a mind-boggling, complex, it's a living ecosystem, and it's truly the heartbeat of an operation like ours. Soil, in our case, is supporting a perennial crop, and that is the pasture. And in a very, very real sense, our farm is a solar operation, because there has never ever been any photovoltaic technology that can remotely compare to photosynthesis. Perhaps the rainforest is better, but otherwise I think there was no better solar panel out there with a multi-species pasture with grass and forbs and whatnot to be able to collect the energy of the sun and store it in a form that is accessible to animals, particularly ruminants. So how to figure out what's an appropriate amount of restraint? I look to, well, not me, I've learned from others that we need to look to what's going on in the wild. And so we need to understand how soil was first pretty much manufactured, and that was, at least here in the Midwest, it was the bisons, and it's these ruminants that come through in huge, massive herds. This can be have parallels in Africa with the zebras and the wildebeest, but what's going on here is that you have a very high density ruminant population that is traveling. They're very peripatetic, and they just constantly eating everything under them. And the grass evolved with these ruminants to be able to handle that, to really be able to even thrive with this kind of really harsh eating down. And it's worth mentioning that what's going on in the soil, because that's really what's supporting the whole pasture. So anytime you eat down whatever's on top of the blade of grass or the clover or whatnot, the roots will mirror exactly what's going on up top. So if you nibble it down to, say, 2 inches or whatnot, the roots underneath are going to pretty much die back to about 2 inches, which is perfectly fine. They have enough reserves within them. They're very resilient that they'll be able to grow right back. And all that dead organic material that died off from the roots becomes not waste, but it becomes food for a whole ecosystem and provides organic matter, and you begin to even store carbon underneath, and you build soil by this way. So you have an entire system going on underneath of interwoven roots that are dying and growing back and dying and growing back, and providing an entire buffet for all the critters and more. I mean, you have microbes and whatever, bacteria and mushrooms and everything underneath there. But what's important for us is that these huge herds of bison came and ate everything, and then of course there's nothing to eat, so they moved on, and there would be a good long while before they would come back to that. And the grass is perfectly fine if it's just eaten down once like that, and it uses its reserve to spurt up again and to put out its blades and leaves, and that way it can capture more sun and rebuild and start the whole process over. It's a very abundant process. It's very a golden egg each time. What happens though on a farm is you often get this growth, The animal goes and eats the grass, and it doesn't move on. We don't mimic nature, and we need to learn these lessons, and we need to learn them so that we can reclaim the abundance of the golden goose. And so for us, we're using electric netting, and we use that is our way of trying to imitate and mimic what's going on in nature, so that we give our animals a fresh piece of grass. If it's the ruminants, then it's every day. Even the meat chickens get a fresh piece every day. The turkeys, we also do that. And then the back fence behind them also gets moved so that they're never on an area for more than 3-4 days. And that allows for the grass to regrow again. And that's the restraint. And if it's used properly, the great thing is that you're encouraging abundance. And instead of going for the maximum, you're getting optimum, and then the whole system begins to grow, and then you have not only very, very healthy animals, but you're also taking care of your soil, which is the ultimate golden goose. And if you take care of your perennial crop of the pasture, then you have a very firm foundation for not only healthy animals, but even very productive animals and a very productive pasture that provides quite a bit of food for the whole system. So earlier I had said that Weathertop was in the business of providing meat, healthy meat, and ecologically responsible meat. But from another perspective, and this is what happens when you are looking at things through an interconnectedness, you're looking at the relationships through things. In another perspective, those are secondary, and our business is a perennial crop of the pasture, and that's really the solar panel. We got to take care of the solar panel. If we're in the solar energy, then that becomes of prime importance, and the other things kind of center around that. And you begin to have, in relationships and interconnected, you begin to have a hierarchy of things. You begin to make decisions depending on, it can depend on the time of year, it can depend on what's important at that time. But there can be a good give and take between all the different types of animals and different operations. Other considerations, there's always a consideration of how we make a living out of this. There's a consideration of pricing. There's a consideration of what kind of other feed implements you give, and all this. There's a give and take. But at the center of it, at the hub, is the pasture, and is the soil that's supporting the pasture. And so we make our decisions. One good example is your stocking rate. So in the winter we don't do as much, and it makes our decisions are made in terms of when the grass is growing and when the grass is at its prime. So, for example, this guy we had from the NRCS come and I was looking for a little help with the project, and he came to check out our place and see what was going on. And immediately he just looked at it and he said, you're at about 10 to 20% of what you could be doing for production. And we were in the middle of the winter, and which doesn't make any sense. So, yes, my stocking rates are lower, and I'm not doing the chickens. I'm not using all my land. Some of the land I have actually stockpiled the grass to provide for a fair amount of feed for the ruminants in the winter, and then I'm supplementing with hay. But many people around here, for the sheep, or the cattle, they're calving or lambing in the middle of the winter or in February. And this is, so you have an extremely high nutritional need, and you have to supplement with a lot of feed. It's not only expensive, but it's not the natural course. It's not easy on the livestock. So for us, we time it so that we lamb when the grass is at its highest. We're lambing about May, and they've had a good month of real flush as the end of their pregnancy, and then they lamb, and then they have really high nutritional needs because they're lactating, and they're usually nursing two little lambs. And so coming in the winter, this man, his idea was maximum, and he told me, oh, you're only at 10-20%, and you need to start adding these supplements, and you need to be feeding this and everything, all which very costly, and not at all in the rhythm of nature. And versus when it comes April, May, I wish he could have come back and see that suddenly this is when I'm at maximum capacity. And this is because we're trying to mirror the seasons and to follow the seasons. Of course, nothing is perfect on a farm, so you'll have a time during the winter where it's just crazy wet, or you've had a bunch of snow and it's now melted, or you've had a bunch of rain or whatnot. And we do have hogs that go through the winter, and so we have to think about this. So I don't put those hogs in the winter on prime pasture. They're sort of in the back with some lesser pasture that doesn't get used quite as much, and it always happens around this time of year where it gets crazy wet, and the hogs are so hard on the pasture. They love pasture. They'll eat it, and then they start digging and everything, and then you get mud involved, and so you kind of have what they would call just a sacrificial area where you just know that it's going to be pretty rough there. And so it's one of those things, compromise, how things interrelate, and I just know that I'll have to go back later on and probably give that pasture a little TLC, maybe even seed a little bit, throw some hay over it, just to give it a little bit of help for regrowth, and maybe let it sit for a little bit longer than you typically would have to. But in each case, it's not only about production. It's about it's a long-term production, right? So that golden goose example is they wanted all the eggs all at once. And that's why you get into words like sustainable or regenerative, because you want to keep that goose healthy. And if you keep the goose healthy, it's going to give you an abundance over and over. But if you want it all at once and you want to maximize everything and cut that goose open, you're going to find out that in the end you're going to pay for it, and you're not going to have nearly the gold that you could have had you had patience and restraint. So to wrap up my ramblings a bit here, I talked earlier about the etymology of the word farm, took a little detour into the gaming world, and I'd like to get back to that and again to sort of recap the differences of the two different paradigms of agriculture. So farm, there is another interesting, at least historically, that farm was originally a word that it was a set tax that you had to give from your lands to the nobles or whatever that they'd come by yearly or whatever, and it was a set figure that, in a sense, was extracted either from you or your land or your business or whatever. Then, in contrast, we use the word in circles now, it's sustainable agriculture or regenerative agriculture. And I think the sustainability definitely speaks to that whole metaphor of the golden goose and the long-term production. And looking at nature as we value efficiency, especially in the American culture, but it's a very myopic, narrow-focused efficiency of narrow scope of doing one thing over and over again. But if you want to talk about real efficiency over the long term, and I mean over the very long term of eons and thousands and millions of years, there's nothing that is as proven as nature. And with the resilience of diversity, with the homeostasis of this whole, what looks like chaos usually up close, from a broader perspective and from taking a step back, you can see that the efficiency is quite an amazing, and there's an amazing abundance there, and unbelievable that we have this little rock and planet in the universe circling around this ball of fire, and everything here seems to be defying the second law of thermodynamics, and we're just growing in complex organisms, and there's there's just this unbelievable abundance of life and of growth. And for a long-term perspective, there's nothing that man has come up with that even remotely compares to that sort of efficiency. So the idea of sustainability, that, the long-term view and the consistent and taking care of that goose so that you can get that abundance, I think is a very crucial to understand the importance of the word. And then, of course, you have that would be a little bit in contrast to regenerative, but I like the idea of regenerative because sustaining can, in many people's minds, can have this idea that you're just maintaining. And regenerative gets at the aspect of it's actually growing, the negentropy, the creative, just nature is procreative, and it's regenerative, and especially when you're dealing with rotational grazing and you're building soil and you're sequestering carbon and you're increasing the nutritional value of things, there's definitely more than just maintaining. We are raising and growing products that are part of this whole system that is actually quite synergistic, and it's quite abundant, and it's procreative. And then, of course, there's agriculture, and agra is the old Greek word for field, and culture, of course, take it as a verb, and you have your biological meaning of, you take a culture, you're cultivating and you're growing you're growing bacteria or whatnot, or as a culture, it's the accomplishments of civilization, all these connotations. But culture is, again, a very, you're taking care of, but you're not only taking care of, there's also very much that productive and creative aspect to it. And I think, there's a lot to say in names, and what happens when you pay attention to words and you pay attention to names. Hopefully it helps a little bit as your orientation towards things. So if it's a little bit cumbersome to say, yeah, we participate in sustainable agriculture or regenerative agriculture versus just saying we farm, it's because of the connotations or the history behind, or what comes to mind. And definitely it's worth it, to me at least, to make these distinctions so that you keep fresh in your mind what the goals are and what your relationship needs to remain to your whole operation, to the animals, to the land, and to the people that we are providing food for. All right, everybody, thanks for listening, and until the next time.